I have a small favor to ask that takes you literally a few seconds. If you like the first 100 podcasts and the guests that we have invited so far, can you do me a small favor and give us a thumbs up on any podcast platform that you are listening on? It helps the podcast more than you think, because the higher we go on the ranking, the more interesting guests we can invite. Thank you again for your support.
Let's do it. Let's do it. Broadcasting from around the world, you're listening to The First 100, a podcast on how founders acquired their first 100 paying customers. Here's your host, Hadi Radwan.
This episode is brought to you by Blocks, the no-code platform that's changing how founders, engineers, and product managers build and ship software. Blocks is like a back-end platform on steroids. With its built-in database and an impressive suite of features, Blocks lets you create workflows, actions, triggers, events, schedulers, and more. You can even handle authentication and notification, all without writing a single line of code. Whether you're building a complex enterprise application or just need to ship an API quickly, Blocks has you covered. It's the fastest way to go from idea to launch. Check out Blocks today on blocks.online. That's www.blocks.online, and build your next project smarter, not harder. Good to have you on the show, Chris. How are you doing today?
Thanks for having me. I'm well, thank you.
Thank you for stopping by. Let me just start with a quick introduction for our listeners. Christian Bach is the founder of Netlify, which is a platform that helps developers build highly performant and dynamic websites and applications. And you've raised to date more than 200 million from notable investors like Bessemer, Anderson Horowitz, and Kleiner Perkins. And more importantly, you have more than 5 million developers using the platform as we speak. And you mentioned like 50 million sites that have been developed. So we'll dive right into that in a bit, but I'd like to maybe ask you a question. Did young Chris exhibit any signs of entrepreneurship early in your life?
Did I early on, like I never had like a lemonade stand or anything like that, right? But I did start, like my career started out just building out computers and setting up office networks, just, after high school to make some money, right? So I guess maybe that was a bit of an inkling, but that was about it, yeah. But I've always had my own thing running, right, as a freelancer and later as an entrepreneur. So.
That's amazing, because we'll talk a little bit about the founding aha moment of Netlify. If you think about the idea, you're one of the early companies that split between front-end and back-end design. You brought in terminologies that were very new early on, Jamstack and microservices. Let's start here before we go into the technicalities. Take us back to the founding aha moment of Netlify. How did it come into fruition?
It was all the way back in 2013. So my good friend from high school actually was already in Silicon Valley. And he was building out and running, I would say, a legacy content management system, right? Legacy in the way that it was still built as a monolith and so on. And he sort of started noticing that the architecture underneath it was shifting, and he felt, hey, I'm building for obsolescence. And he reached out to me. I come from an agency background. I was chief digital officer there, right? And so a lot of the pain points associated with the legacy way of doing it, where the front end and back end are all part of one big piece of software, and you have to visit a server that has to build out a version of a site every time you for every visitor, right? Were sort of things that I thought were the premise of doing business online. And he was sort of explaining, I think like architecturally speaking, this is different, right? I think you can do something about it. I think we can split out the front end from the back end. And there was proof in the pudding, because essentially that's what's happened with mobile apps, right? So when Steve Jobs introduced the iPhone for the very first time, it was a PDF, right? Because they hadn't built the phone yet. But back then, all those icons that today are Instagram and our mail app and so on, they were all meant as websites. They were just links to websites. And then we sort of collectively found out that pulling in the UI every time we turn a page and so on was not going to scale, right? Like the architecture itself wasn't fast enough. The phones weren't fast enough. The broadband weren't fast enough. And so they ended up saying, hey, why don't we pre-build the app, download it and use the phone's operating system to run it, what we call the runtime, right? And then if you need anything real-time updating, or someone needs to, stream music from Spotify, sign up with a newsletter, whatever it is, any sort of real-time data exchange, we'll do that from somewhere else, right? And so that bifurcation, that decoupling made so much sense then. Of course, that was really good for Apple, right? But not so good for the net, right? Like the notion of an app store is obviously super proprietary and so on, right? So as I started diving in, I started seeing that a lot of the big issues around scalability, around security, and around performance actually had to do with an underlying architecture for the web that was struggling. And we started seeing if you decouple the web, the front end is no longer dictated by the back end. We can sort of embrace microservices and headless APIs. It'll work so much better in so many other ways. Also because we were starting to get a lot of digital touch points. So this notion that one backend had to be good at building out for all very, very different touch points was also not making a lot of sense. So you started really feeling the compromise of that. But if you could separately build out for each touch point, so, on the premise of that touch point, and then have the API just be an API and do what they do well, right? Whether it's commerce or content management or something. That just seemed like a much better world. So I got more and more excited. And in 2015, we came out of private beta in March. And, today, I think we were one of the 2-3 first companies in the space. Netlify, our mission became to saying, hey, if you do this, if you're saying, now I have my front end separate, I have my commerce, my payment, and all these things, and I get best-in-class components, how do they talk together? Like, how does that actually become a thing? You need a platform, a new reimagined kind of platform that does all of that and hosts it and runs it as applications afterwards, right? And sites and stores and so on. And that became our mission. So we're sort of the modern glue layer, the modern operation and orchestration of what we today call a composable web. And of course, doing this meant it was a category play. And back then, we could only service very small use cases because there was no one else. Like, for example, you couldn't do commerce because there was no commerce provider that provided anything else but a traditional monolith. And so we had to push forward our company, of course, right? But we also had to push forward very much a category. We were dependent on this developing of other companies being created and starting providing services, right? And so it's been a very partner-centric move from the beginning, where we really had to push forward. And that's where the Jamstack came in. We sort of created this term, which all had to do with best practices of how to create these decoupled sites. And that also became a bit of an umbrella that other companies could mirror themselves in and say, hey, like that's part of the story that we're helping out with as well. So, and it just helped it solidify into a thing, so to speak, right? And I think that was what helped it take off as a category. And then later it evolved, and today we talk about composable architecture. There's a MAC Alliance, microservice APIs, cloud and headless, right? That I sit on the board of currently, right? And Netlify is a member of, and today instead of 2 or 3 companies, we have 4,000. And that's probably being conservative. And all the traditional existing companies have now either gone away or pivoted to also having headless components and separated front end and so on. So it is really today just becoming quite default way of building your digital applications, websites, stores, and so on. And we continue to be that glue layer, and we continue to see the components out there, the content management system, commerce system, just exploding, right? And there's so many to choose between today. So yeah, that's the
Thank you very much for the historical background on this. Before you had 5 million, you had 1 million, and before you had 1 million,
that's right.
You had 100.
Before we had 1 million, we had 2 people.
Yeah. So take us back to that moment. What were your early strategies to get customers in? Because such a new concept, if you're going to the developer, a developer is very accustomed to traditional coding. Now you're saying to them, you have to do things a little bit different. But more importantly, most of these developers sit in an ecosystem or in a company. So how were you able first to convince users to use your platform, and then how were you able to get them to pay?
Yeah, I think if we talk about the adoption story, I think it really starts with even product market fit, completely original. So instead of saying we have to build out this glue code and this is what it looks like, and then seeing how do we get people to use it, we more sort of said, okay, if we think of this notion of separating out the front end, let's just take that at scale. It's very successful. If that's how people build, in general, companies, developers, what else are they going to do? Well, obviously they would need headless services, as we just talked about, right? They would need different things like commerce components, payment components, content management components. And then we looked at sort of, okay, if that's the world, if we go here, what else would be? What kind of tooling? What kind of workflows? And then when you have that sort of worldview of saying this is where we think we're going, then we reverse engineer it and saying what needs to be built and what can we viably help with. And that's when we sort of figured out that workflow, the continuous deployment and integration, that whole idea of operation and orchestration of everything that goes into these things in order to support more complex use cases. Because you don't really need it if you're building a blog, but you really do need it if you're building anything else, right? And so in that, obviously, it was very obvious to us that this had to start as a developer bottom-up motion. That means that for us, success didn't look like making a lot of money in the beginning. It looked like getting into the tool builds of as many developers as possible. And then as the use cases would increase in complexity, right, then these developers also have day jobs, right? And so they might be building out something simple in their free time, but they'll be working in enterprises. And then they'll take your product with them into these enterprises. And so it became the typical bottom-up motion that we had to do. We could also see that would mean that we needed a freemium version, right? That means that you have a free plan. And I always said back then that if I could push a magic button where developers would never have to pay us, but only the companies they work in, I'd push it in a heartbeat, right? But the notion was that you have a free plan that traditionally is quite expensive, right? Because you want those developers to be able to try every part of your product. And then with usage and with advanced functionality around compliance, security, support, and so on, that's when you go into higher tiers where you charge companies real money, but also provide a different kind of value. And so that was sort of identifying that early on. And then you say, okay, so how do we get started here, right? Again, for us, it was about we start with the developers. We just get into that workflow. Now, there's many parts of this. One was the category play, right? And that was saying, so if this category takes off, this way of building is going to need resources, like any resource, right? So if you invent flat TVs and you start selling them, then there's going to be a comparison site somewhere in the net, like artings.com, that would go and test these TVs and compare them, right? And in the same way, sort of what are the things that would be needed here? So we launched staticgen.com, which was became the largest online directory of open source site generators in the world. And every one of those site generators, which were open source, you just had a deploy to Netlify button, so you can get started really quickly. And it was also a great way of showing the world that this is how easy it is. You click a button, it spins out a site, and you push it to Git. And then all the steps you would take after that would just be automated away. So yes, it's true that we had to tell developers to do things in a new way. But at the same time, the Git workflow that they were used to, it was the exact same thing. We were just able to automate it, right? Because we're pre-building things to a much larger degree. So when you push to Git, normally you would have to download it and build it out and get it to a staging environment, make sure the versions of Apache and PHP or SQL or whatever is the same as the production environment. And now you have a site live and you can share the URL. With us, you literally would just push to Git. And our first support requests and tickets were always sort of like, hey, like I did what it said, but now there's nothing. Like it doesn't work. And we're like, no, actually scroll down, click that link. That's it. The site is done. They're like, really? and in that way of working with deploy previews, which is even a term we came up with, which is completely standard across the globe today, that was pretty unheard of, right? And so, yes, we had to teach them to do something new, but we also had the advantage that Netlify itself was actually something where you didn't need to do something new, but where we can just come in and automate a bunch of the steps that they were already doing. And so it just became a very easy win. So I think when you deal with developers, you need to have a quick magic moment. Within 30 seconds, they have to experience the sort of an aha moment, right? That was easy, right? Wow, did it just do that? And that needs to come pretty early on. So we had a big focus on that, right? We had a claim like one of our product designers put a site live from start to finish in I think 34 seconds and so on, right? Including like signing up with GitHub, something like that, right? And then we were like, hey, this can be you. And so make it easy, specific target audience, don't care about advanced use cases in the beginning, and then get in front of as many developers as possible via, for example, staticgen.com, headlesscms.org, jamstack.org, which was a manifest, right? Being out speaking at whatever events we could find, and then also our early developer advocates. Our first 12 employees, we had them in the contract said developer advocacy. And that was because, like, that's it. Like, we don't have a marketing department. Like, we qualify our product by demonstrating it. So even if you're working on backend, then write a blog about it. Get it out there, right? This is developers to developers, right? And I think that was quite important. And also the people that joined us early was very much joining us because they believed that this was a better way for the web, right? So they were really in it to build a better web. It was very mission driven like that. And so like those were some of the elements, right? It was pretty rock and roll, of course, right? The developer advocacy was much more around learning in public. Like we've got one guy that we just saw was good at writing, but he was a very new developer. And then we said, hey, we need to port this app from Angular to React. And he didn't know how to do it, but that meant that was great, right? Because he would make no assumptions. And so as he was teaching everyone else, they came along at the same pace that he did. And so we learned a lot from that, right? Of sometimes you can have an expert that will give a demonstration, but they have so many unconscious assumptions that unless you're really at their level, it's very hard to follow. And so this idea of learning while communicating and while teaching was a really powerful one, and it resonated really well with developers. But yeah, so that was an approach as well, right? And so again, what are you building towards? What is your role in it? What's the initial target audience? What does success look like for them, even if it's limited use cases, right? And then how do you get in front of as many of them as possible? And how do you have that magic moment quickly? So that was the original go-to-market.
That's a great framework, actually, to be used by anyone who's building a startup from scratch. You talk about the early acquisition strategies. You mentioned being in front of the audience, advocacy. Is there any tactic that you've deployed early on? Because every startup doesn't have a lot of funds at the start. You're doing things by maybe cold outreach, could be any tactic that you've done that has served you really well early on?
Yeah. I mean, like part of it, staticgen.com, headlesscms.org, we did this notion that all the open source projects, they all had READMEs. And we made a pull request for each of them so you can just deploy that README as a site. Because it was super easy, right? It's just a super small static site. But that wasn't a thing back then. You would, again, need to set up hosting and everything else. Now you click the button and you were done. And so, but that meant that we were mentioned and we were part of it. And it was a Netlify site for all these different projects, right? So this kind of guerrilla marketing where you get into when you get a little bit of a network effect, right? And you get out there. That was really important. And it didn't actually require that much from us, our side, sorry. And then at the same time, there was these different resources that was important as well, right? Another thing is really identify is that, yes, you're for developers, but who are the early movers? Who are the trendsetters, right? Who are the ones that you really want to get in front of? That sort of point at an arrow, whether they do it intentionally or not for everyone else. And where are they? And in our case, most developers have tried making a framework, a site generator as a project at some point, right? And they open sourced them, of course. And so that was what statgen.com was all about. And so it gave us really good access to all of them because, they would make a pull request to get it in. And so we can see who did it. We can contact them and we can say, hey, would you want to jump on a call? We have a joint mission here. This is all part of building a better version for the web. And some of them were like, well, I was just playing around this thing. I didn't even think about this as part of a larger thing, right? And so get them just thinking like that was exciting. And other times they were like, hey, this is great. Let's do some content together, right? And then if we tweet about them, they tweet about us, and you get a reach a larger audience, right? So being mindful of who you're interacting with, who's the choir, right? When we were even defining what is this, because we could have, an early category thing is a creation, is naming something that already exists to some extent, right? And so the lines in the sand is pretty arbitrary. It's wherever you want to put them. Like, does this include sort of best practices for the distribution of the content afterwards, which it did in Jamstack, which was this notion of redesigning delivery networks to also deliver the apps and the sites themselves, and not just content like media, images, or video files, right? So, but that could also not have been part of it, right? And so when you do this in the beginning, I think, getting the validation from others and getting that notion out there is really important. You can't do that alone. And so I think interacting with that kind of community was really important for us, right? And getting the right kind of people to start thinking about this, talking about this, solidified it into a movement, into hey, this is a new way to build applications and sites, rather than this is a next level site generator or JavaScript framework, something more isolated.
Is there a crucible moment in the life of Netlify that could have taken the company in the other direction? I know you're now $1 billion company, but are there any moments or one moment that you remember?
Wasn't it Mark Andreessen that's quoted for once saying that startups is just like, you only ever experience two emotions, is either euphoria or terror. You go through many of those every day, and they both seem to be exasperated by the lack of sleep, right? I feel like one moment, there's a lot of moments, right? No, I think like there's a few. So first of all, at some point you're going to have to make money. And so in the beginning, this is about sort of proving out that this is a category play, right? And Jamstack was, of course, a big part of this as well, right? And you prove out that this is much more than just what you're bringing. It's part of a grander story, which helps you fundraise as well. You also have proof that there is traction, even if they're not using you for big, expensive products yet, because the use cases are originally a little limited. Then you have to be on a path to something, right? And so, but then at some point you're going to say, hey, now it has to be able to be translated into revenue. Otherwise, we can't afford to keep funding this. And so in that, a classical thing is very often that, and we had our own. We had a very large FMCG, which is companies that have a lot of consumer goods that are sold in supermarkets and stuff like that, right? And there's a few of some large ones. And there was one of them, and he was really seeing this. He got the vision. He was a chief enterprise architect for this company. And in our case, he was like, sort of like, you know what? I'm going to need all these things and compliance and so on, right? And it was pretty early. And that would have been by far the quickest way to a six-figure deal. But it would also have eaten our roadmap, right? It would have made us more enterprising. It would have made us less aware of everything else that was going on around us. And so it would have led to more revenue quicker, but less revenue at length, I think, right? It would have pigeonholed us a little bit, and make us a little less applicable in a wider sense. And so I think like that was, for example, and sometimes that's the right thing to do, by the way, right? I'm not, whatever. Like whoever's listening to this will have their own company and know what's right for them. But in our case, we sort of wanted to go a little broader. So I think there was some very hard decisions, right? Because this is a huge opportunity for a young startup, right? To be a crucial part of an infrastructure from a very large company, right? But in this case, we could also see that we would have to look down and build this for 3 years and then look back up again, and who knows what the world would have looked like at that point, right? And would we even have been successful in doing this? Because again, what we supplied was also very dependent on the ecosystem evolving around us. So I think like that's one moment, right? I often feel that those pivotal things, once you have the initial product fit, right, and you've gotten some capital, you build a team, and you're starting to move, it's very often the big shifts very often come in who are you going to cater, right? And are you going to go enterprise, and what does that mean? Does that mean that you move away from a freemium model, right? Or you don't have a self-serve tier, but you only have free and an enterprise pricing, who are you catering, right? And I think that matters for the people you hire, the people that work there. It matters for you go to market. It matters for the DNA of the company. Like that can really, really make a difference, right? So those are probably the biggest things. But there's so many times where we sat, for example, in our product roadmap. And I think in a composable ecosystem, you can sort of say, well, we're going to have the frameworks as well. or we're going to have a content management, or we're going to have something like that that would help. That would translate into us suggesting a specific flavor. Whereas what Netlify wanted to do was just be the glue, just be the operating. Like, you bring whatever you want. We make it sing together. But we don't want to be opinionated around the type of commerce solution that you use, because that's the whole point here. We are here to enable you as a developer and you as a company to mix and match and change individual parts. So I don't have to change, just because I need a new content management system, I don't have to change 37 other things. I can just take that component, lift it out, and put something else in instead. That's the dream. And so we've been very careful of following that line. But of course, that also meant saying no to some other opportunities that a lot of clients wanted from us, right? And a lot of users wanted. So those are hard choices, right? And it's also impossible to even know if you were right, because who knows what would have happened if we went the other way. It would have been different for sure, right? So yeah, I feel like this notion that there's times where you could have ended up very differently in a tech startup, software as a service today, there's so many. There's more than one.
Absolutely. Where do you think today is the industry heading? No code, low code is the new flavor.
Absolutely.
And what trends do you see?
Today, yes. So if we look at this, right, from a helicopter point of view, let's start with what I've been talking about for the last 20 minutes, which is this notion of a composable world, right, where you mix and match different software components rather than buy one big fat solution. That has become everything. Like, if you, I think, go to the big analyst firms like Gartner and Forrester, and they will say the vast, vast majority of all companies are building this way already, will build this way this year. I think if you look at the number of new digital applications where the front end has been separated out from the back end, we're way past 90%. So I think it's, in other words, become default. So that's one thing. That also carries a lot with it. So in our world, it's no longer just about the developer workflows. Now you have marketers, you have business stakeholders. They need to be catered in this way as well. Like, if you're a business stakeholder, it's great that you have flexibility and agility and mixing and matching all these tools, but they want holistic solutions. How are they created? You have to help them out as well. And so I think if we look at our corner of the composable web economy, we've gotten to a place where you can build anything today. It's very prominent architecture is employed by the largest of enterprises in the world, and it's by no means just a developer motion. Then, in general, when you think about low code and no code in our world, of course, like for example, Netlify, we looked at something like visual editing, which is the no code way of saying, I have a website, I want to change some things visually, and you can have a marketing coordinator do that. Now, that has been sold for the last 20, 25 years, but only as part of a content source, right? So it came as part of a content management system, for example. But the whole point now is that you have more than one content source. Like, that's what we are preaching. In this composable world, you have all these, and you have mergers and acquisitions, and in 2024, if you have enterprise that's been around for a while, you have a ton. And so there was a need to reinvent visual editing where you can work with multiple content sources underneath it, but still have the same visual editing workflow. So we acquired a company, and that's now part of our offerings there. But that was a need that didn't exist early on, right? The sophistication went there, the users went there, it was developer only. And so I think that's an example of the richness and complexity of this new way of building for the web has reached a scale where you also open up for these use cases. Outside of that, I think if we zoom out and we're no longer just talking about composable web, but we're talking about the future of digital solutions, I very much see, obviously, Gen AI playing a big role. At Netlify, we have more than 500,000 sites a year right now that are completely prompted by AI. So just by our integrations into things like ChatGPT, they just spit out websites on the other end. Now, these are gimmicky, simple websites, but it's coming, right? And so I think a lot of web developers that today sit in frameworks, they're going to abstract one level up and sit and more talk about the layer of assertions around sort of, instrumenting a machine to do the actual code. And so I think like that's another way of low code, but it's code to the same extent, right? It's still a set of instructions. You still have to be really mindful of what goes in there. And so I do think that developers will move up there, but your own ability to understand code as code, right, is in a more traditional way, becomes a little less relevant. And then I think you see things like, we already moved the design into the browser. Think of Figma, for example, right? Like, so it's an online collaborative mode. And you have popular coding frameworks like VS Code and so on. You have Copilot and all those things. And I think something like a Figma or something like a design tool will be natively code as well as we move forward in new generations, right? So it's just code by default. That changes how the designer can work, because today a designer can work inside, if you talk about production sites, they can maybe work in a site builder, right? But a site builder is templated, it has taken a bunch of choices for you, and that's why it's used for small solutions and not large ones, because they're not very configurable. That's the whole point. That's great, right? They're wonderful, but they're made more for people that don't code and so on. But I think if design is code, you can start having designers, sort of actually sit and evolve production sites on the fly. So I think that's going to be really interesting. And then the last thing is, I think that we have quite rudimentary personalization today as an industry. 40% of the Fortune 500, 100% of them have invested in personalization as tooling. However, 40% of them don't use it at all, right? Experimentation, A/B testing, personalization is rudimentary. It's very manual. It requires a bunch of work. It's not fast enough. Just flat out, if we're honest about this, it's been sold as a holy grail for a long time, and there's not a lot out there because it doesn't work very well. However, I think with AI and with everything that's coming, I think we're going to have a lot more conversational websites, which means that 100,000 users at the end of the day will have 100,000 different experiences, right? And that's not something that we can sit and do real time. So again, we're going to be really sort of leaning into AI and automation tools and so on to help do that for us, right? So there's a bunch of really exciting things happening in that space, and it's happening really quickly too.
Exactly. I think you nailed it on the spot. There's a thing about having now technical skills simplified, because now a creative person who doesn't have the ability to code, they have now assistive tools around them to bring into life what they have in mind without actually using a lot of resources. Like you mentioned, these no-code tools, the AI components, you can ask an AI to generate a simple website, tomorrow a complex website. That's something in your head. They build the code, they send it to different deployment things, they build it together, and then you have a website without actually being a technical developer. And that's the beauty about all of these tools. We're yet in a phase where this is getting built, but do you think in the future we'll have a huge hockey stick effect and sites built and different creative ideations that are harder now to get because you're communicating to someone else and someone else is building for you versus you building it and testing and iterating very quickly?
Yes, I think a future will carry more, high iteration that's faster, right? I think it'll enable you to create a lot more content, a lot more sites and so on, right, than before. So I do think we'll have an acceleration. I think we'll have a lot more published. But I also think there's different things. If you think of the aggregators today, like at Google, that's what I mean, right? Like today already, if you search for the weather, it won't take you to weatherchannel.com anymore. It'll just show you the weather right there in the search results, right? And plane tickets and so on. And with AI, that's going to be more and more of a case, right? But what does it mean for a brand that wants to build a relationship with someone? So we came 20 years ago. I was part of that movement of doing like flash video and these very rich, immersive websites. They were slow. They were processor intensive. They were not secure. We moved away from it. Flash died. Fair enough. However, and Netlify has been part of the next story, right, of making this as fast as humanly possible. And we just need to get the right information there as quick as we can, just ease the journey of the user, right? Help connect the dots. But I think we're going to see a bit of a shift back towards saying, well, I need to build a differentiating, immersive brand experience, because how else am I going to get, like, if the value add is purely just information, that information is going to be existing inside the aggregators. You see a ton of social commerce now or you're buying direct on Instagram, right? You're not even moving over to the websites for the e-commerce stores, right? And we're only going to see a lot more of that. And another thing is content marketing. I was traveling around Europe talking about content marketing 15 years ago as this way of don't just advertise your product, qualify it, demonstrate it, integrate it, prove it. And I thought it was a wonderful motion, and YouTube was a big part of that as well, right? I was traveling with someone from Google who was talking about YouTube back then and demonstrating how that could be used. But today with AI content generation, every company is doing this. We're on a podcast here for a company that 10 years ago might not have had a podcast, right? And so that also means a deep, deep saturation. And so if you flip it and you're the user, and I want to know about, I don't know, Ubuntu or whatever, right? Now there's like thousands of pieces of content out there. And so how do I navigate that? So I also think that that's going to mean new ways of create. We have to double down on creativity, right? Like we can't just, it's not enough to get the information out there and surface it, right? Like you have to work a lot harder to get in front of people. And I think we're really going to have to put a lot more effort into how we're relevant and how do we build brand relations, because of the answer to your first questions is yes, it's a resounding yes. There will be so much out there, so many sites, so much content. There's already a lot. But with the way of someone you can have a marketing coordinator creating 100 websites a day in a not so distant future, that's just going to explode even more, right? And so standing out is going to be the challenge. It's not going to be production anymore. It's going to be how do you make it relevant, which is probably a good thing at the end of the day, right? Like there's too much junk already. Let's make something good.
Quality is king. I know we went over time. I want to be respectful of your time. One last question I ask every guest is, what's a principle they live by that has served them well on their journey?
Yes. So for me, it's personal, right? It's how I govern things is I try to let my choices be governed by hope and not fear. I think it's such a default behavior that we seek comfort and that very often we make a choice based on if I don't, then something bad could happen or what I could lose something or something like that, right? And I think that's a bit of a shame. I think, for example, when I went here, I left a very cushy job in Denmark. I came to the most expensive city in the world and I had no salary because I was in a startup, right? And everyone back home was like, "Are you insane? Like, what are you doing?" Right? and also I wasn't a tech founder until that. I came from agency world, right? So they were like, "Are you double insane? Like, this is really a bad idea, man." But if I hadn't, I wouldn't be sitting talking here with you today, right? And so there were so many reasons not to do it if I had come at it from the other angle. But what if we succeeded, right? What if we could actually make a difference? What if we could play a meaningful part in the web fighting back? Wow, right? And I think at larger decisions, I really try to remind myself of, try to be governed by hope without being like too hopelessness, naive, of course, right? But that has really served me well. And I feel I'm happier for it, to be honest.
Amazing. I mean, you're one of the first guests I've talked to which have used this principle of hope. Most of them are quite different. I think I've collected so far 170 different principles.
Wow.
About because it's part of what they've built. It's always, it's the cornerstone, is that principle or set of principles that pushes them either to stay in a cushy job or to take that risk and do what, Jeff Bezos said, regret minimization framework. I don't want to regret this decision at the age of 80. Chris, this was amazing. What's next for Netlify and yourself as well?
Well, so, I mean, Netlify is embracing those things that we talked about, right? So we're implementing a ton of AI right now. For example, if you now build your website and it fails because you made an error, it ends up, like, as soon as you have the build failure, you have why, because AI analyzed it, and the 3 things you can do to fix it, right? And a million features, or not a million, but many features just like that, right? And so because AI for me, especially generative AI, is about taking something that used to be manual and automating it. And that's the story of Netlify. So we're really riding this wave right now of enterprises, especially being very aware of having to lean into automation because there's just too many moving parts. And so we sit really well there. And so we're helping the next generation, not just developers, but also marketers and business stakeholders embrace a modern web, right? Which is very interesting because 10 years ago, you sit down with a CIO or CTO, they would always be talking about, or you would be, the headline would always be, let's find the right solution for you. Whereas today it's much more about, let's make you agile enough, flexible enough that you can, mix and match the different tools that is coming out every day and both use them and also be able to discontinue using them without too much friction, right? It's all about sort of making sure that your workflows and your stack is agile enough, right? I think we've now learned that digital transformation is continuous. And for that, you really need to double down on workflows. And that's what Netlify keeps growing in. So that's Netlify's story, right? And my own is also, on this journey, I helped build out the ecosystem to the extent that I could as an angel investor. I sit on a bunch of advisory and executive boards, but I've also now stepped out full-time off Netlify. So that was a big move. I've been the CSO for a few years now, and now I'm still sit on the board, and I'm still very active in it. Of course, it's more than just a passion project, right? It's a big part of what I've been doing for many, many years. But I'm also leaning into climate technology, something that I'm very passionate about and where I'm learning a ton every day, and I'm very excited about it. So about being governed by hope, not fear, right? That's one more thinking, let's just make a run for it, right? Because of course, you could find a lot of reasons for why I should just double down on the space that I'm already in. But extending that, it's not that I'm leaving the space entirely, but sort of really double-clicking on climate technology and helping those startups get fundraising and their narrative right and go-to-market motions right and so on, right, is super exciting for me as well. And I'm very, very excited about moving that forward.
Amazing. Thank you very much, Chris, for sharing your story and the story of Netlify as well. We wish you the best of luck. How can people reach you, and are you hiring at Netlify?
Absolutely. So for Netlify as such, right, there's obviously contact pages, career pages and so on there. There's LinkedIn. There's many ways of finding us and engaging with us, right? And me, I'm, LinkedIn or chris@netlify.com, right? Should I have given that? You know what? I get so much spam anyway, right?
Yes. We'll put that in the show notes. I hope you don't get unsolicited emails. But thank you again, and good luck on your next journey with climate tech. Anything that our audience can help you with, we'll put everything in the show notes again. Thank you very much, Chris.
Thank you so much for having me. It was a pleasure.
This episode is brought to you by Blocks, the no-code platform that's changing how founders, engineers, and product managers build and ship software. Blocks is like a back-end platform on steroids. With its built-in database and an impressive suite of features, Blocks lets you create workflows, actions, triggers, events, schedulers, and more. You can even handle authentication and notification, all without writing a single line of code. Whether you're building a complex enterprise application or just need to ship an API quickly, Blocks has you covered. It's the fastest way to go from idea to launch. Check out Blocks today on blocks.online. That's www.blocks.online, and build your next project smarter, not harder.
Thank you so much for listening to the First 100. We hope it inspired you in your journey. If you're enjoying the podcast, please subscribe to our podcast on Apple iTunes, Stitcher, Google Play, or Spotify, and share it with a friend starting their entrepreneurship journey. Leave us a 5-star review. Your support will help spread our podcast to more viewers.